Next one, I would like to introduce our expert, Dr. Samuel Brady from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He is the Chief of Medical Physicists at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and he also one of the most popular IAEA experts that come to Thailand. And this is his third time that he's agreed to give a lectures to us. So today he's gonna talk about imaging quality metrics and imaging quality metrics. What should be correct as a lecture number one. And the second one gonna be those metrics. What should be correct. So in between that, if someone has any questions or want to comment or ask something, so you can raise your hand and we can let you talk during the each session, or you can type in the questions to the chat box and also the comment on Facebook Live. So welcome, Sam.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Admittedly, I wish I was in Thailand. It's minus 6 degrees Celsius where I'm at right now. It's too cold.
It's too cold. It's not the same as in Thailand.
So I miss being with you. I hope that we can be together soon. I hope COVID will go away real quick and we can have our next meeting and we'll do it in Thailand. So yes. Thank you for the invitation to be here. As Tanya mentioned, I'm going to share with you today 2 topics. The first will be centered around image quality. And the topic of my first discussion will be image metrics. What should we collect? And then after our question and answer period, we'll talk about radiation dose. So very briefly, just to establish the framework for this mission and what we're going to talk about. Today, of course, as I mentioned, we're going to introduce the topics of image quality and radiation dose. And next week, we're going to talk even more about dose reference levels and how we use those. And as Jiraporn and Panutai has discussed, you in Thailand have come a long ways establishing DRLs. You've established DRLs in 3 basic modalities in CT and mammography, and then in plain film radiography. And so you guys have made many strides over the last several years. And so we're going to talk about more hands-on application. And then we're going to go into detail in each of the various different modalities. And so in the month of March, we will spend time talking about CT. CT obviously is very complicated. It's very widely used in Thailand. And therefore, we're going to break it up and we're going to talk a little bit about each of the various different body parts so that we can spend more time talking about the importance of DRLs as they affect, for example, the trunk, the chest, abdomen, pelvis, and the head, and then in specialty applications such as cardiac. One thing you'll notice as we discuss each of these modalities is each modality, each session will have a topic that will focus on image quality and then on radiation dose. And as we talk today, obviously you can appreciate, and I know you already know, but the 2 go hand in hand. And so we'll talk about that same theme when we go from each topic. And so after CT, we will talk about fluoroscopy. And then after fluoroscopy, we're going to talk about plain films, planar radiography, CR and DR. And then after that, of course, we're going to talk about mammography and breast tomosynthesis. And this will round out our overall mission as we talk about the main ionizing radiation modalities. And then our last session, when we come together in the end of May, we will talk about the overall picture of the dose index registry and how we interpret this data so that we can move forward to the next phase of the larger mission that Jiraporn just introduced. So transitioning today to my very first topic, my question to you is, in the end goal, if the end goal of these IAEA expert missions is to collect and analyze high national doses, why talk about image quality first? Well, as we all know, image quality is related to radiation dose. As radiation dose decreases in the image formation, so does also the image quality go down. As you can see here, in this case, this was a cadaver that was imaged 3 different times. One at almost 43 milligray with a volume CTDI. And then 1/40th of that dose when we imaged it again at about 1 milligray. And then again, we took off another 10, a factor of 10, when we imaged at 0.2 milligray. And you can see as we reduced the dose, obviously the image quality decreased. So you all know this. You understand this concept as noise and dose are inversely related. And the nice thing about the way this relationship works is if I turn the dose knob, for example, if I reduce the dose by 1/2, noise only actually goes up by 40%. And conversely, if we double dose, noise will only decrease by 30%. So there is a pro and a con to this. The first is we can really turn down our dose without as much a penalty to image noise. And that's a good thing for our patients. We can really go from 43 milligray down to, say, possibly 1 milligray, and we can still have that same diagnostic confidence in whatever diagnostic task we need. So the overarching question is, what is image quality? If radiation dose is linked to image quality, how do we define image quality? Well, image quality is a metric that we use to define the way we perceive the way the image appears to us, or its perceived image quality. And so, no doubt, every radiologist online would probably prefer to make their diagnosis from an image here on the left. But the question we should ask is, can they make their same diagnostic task with an image that is produced using much less radiation? In which case, then, which one of these images on the bottom has the best image quality? Well, it tends to be the image that answers the diagnostic question. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what different metrics we can use to determine or calculate image quality. But before we get there, we must describe a framework. So if we do not establish a framework in which we can define good image quality, what ultimately happens is patients will be overexposed to radiation. And so, as an example, there was a publication that came out in 2009. So 11 years ago, a group in San Francisco, in California, in the US, they looked at 4 major hospitals. And they looked at a little over 1,000 adult patient images. And what they found was that in that group, in that population, there was a 13-fold variation from the highest dose to the lowest dose. And so to put this in a graph, you can see here on the y-axis the effective dose, or the population dose, that this group in Northern California received. And you can see, as a function of the various different types of imaging protocols, you can see the average was mostly constant, but the maximum values, depending on which protocol they used, could be pretty extreme. As an example here, this multiphasic abdominal pelvis, it had a minimum imaging technique of less than 10 millisieverts, and in one instance, a maximum of 90. And so what we see here is, if there's no framework to define what good image quality is, then a variation a large variation occurs in the imaging chain. No doubt, when you look at the median value in all of these, no doubt the median value was probably sufficient for the diagnostic task at hand. And that is why, of course, it's the average or the median. And when you look at a box plot, this whisker plot, the top line represents the 75th percentile, which, as we will discuss, and as you probably already recall from our various different previous meetings, that represents the potential, that is the national DRL. And so the median value and the DRL provide us a framework in which we can establish what is good dose or good image quality. And we can use that as a goal to reduce all of these overexposures and to review all of these potential underexposures. So once again, let's review some basic definitions of image quality. You can group image quality into two general topics. The first would be an objective analysis. So if we observe image quality objectively, we can quantify it, we can measure it, we can define it. It tends to be mathematical. And almost always we will use a standard to measure image quality, such as a phantom. Although you can use patient images to measure and calculate objective image quality. What you will find, as we discussed today, that most of the time when we do objective calculations of image quality, it can be inflexible. And I'll explain what that means as we go along. So then the other way we can approach analyzing and describing image quality is subjective. Subjective, of course, being opinion-based. My opinion versus your opinion. And it's the way that we perceive the image and its quality. So subjective image quality is defined more based on experience. An experienced radiologist may be able to make a diagnostic read with an image that may be less or have lower image quality compared to maybe a younger or a new radiologist. And when we do this, oftentimes what we need to do is we need to get a consensus. We need to get multiple individuals, multiple radiologists of different experience levels, so that they can help us define what is good image quality based on their perception. And one of the strengths and probably the most powerful thing about using a subjective metric is that we can actually use it to define a clinical task. And once again, we'll describe this as we go along. So let's break this down and go into the details of this. So let's review a few common objective image quality metrics. So the first task that oftentimes we want to analyze is, how can we resolve or differentiate two objects that are close together? If a system, a detector, say a digital radiographic detector, captures an image, and we want to know if two objects are very close together in the body, can that detector resolve them as separate individual objects, or does it blur them together to create just one object that is visualized with the eye? And the other way we look at spatial detail, besides being able to separate them, is how crisp or how sharp are the edges. And obviously, as you can see with the hand here on the left, you can see how the edge of the bone structure is very sharp, very defined, whereas the one on the right is not. There's a gradient to the reconstruction of that image, and it tends to be blurrier to the eye. And so how do we define image quality when we're talking about sharpness or spatial resolution? And what we typically use is a metric called the MTF, or the modulation transfer function. And the modulation transfer function looks at the ability of a system, a detector, for example, to resolve two objects. And so we have, for example, here in this pattern, we have an object right here that's white that absorbs a lot of the radiation. We could assume it's a bone, as it's right next to an area that doesn't absorb radiation, such as the lung field. And so when you have these two objects right next to each other, they're very distinct and defined. And so the system is able to differentiate the two very well. And now if you have multiples of these objects, as they get closer and closer together, the detector has a harder time differentiating or separating the two. And additionally, the overall magnitude of the signal decreases as the objects get closer together. And so when we apply mathematics to this, we can calculate what's called the modulation transfer function, which is this blue line right here. Now, there is a different way to look at this. Now, in radiology, not everything is has a perfect contrast, perfect black and white. There's a lot of objects in the body in a radiograph or a CT image that has various different or lower levels of contrast. And so when we take into account the ability to look at objects close in space and at different contrast levels, we use what's called the task specific transfer function, or the TTF. Either one, however we choose to use them, if we look at the overall graph, as the graph approaches a horizontal line, the closer it is to this upper right-hand corner of the graph, the better the detector, the better the imaging system. And conversely, if the blue line falls off quickly and goes down, and it's closer down here on the left side of this graph, then the system will make the objects more blurry, and it'll be harder to look at objects that are closer together. So we can make a very defined calculation on how well the imaging system is in resolving our images. So another way we want to define image quality is our ability to clearly see anatomy or a physiological process, if we're using fluoroscopy or nuclear medicine. So we know radiation detection is a statistical process. Therefore, if we have more photons, more radiation, when they interact with the body and pass through the body and interact with the detector, we have more statistics to calculate the image or reconstruct the image. Therefore, an image that's acquired with more radiation will look more statistically clean or pure. There's less variation in the image. And when it's less radiation, of course, it's more variable, and therefore we call this quantum noise or image noise. And that image noise that is superimposed over the anatomy can at times cloud or cover up what the radiologist needs to see. So a very simple way for us to define how much of this image noise is in the image is we can place a simple region of interest or an ROI in the image, and we can look at either multiple parts of the anatomy or multiple areas within one type of anatomy, say the gray matter or the white matter. And we can look at all of the pixels inside that region of interest. And we can do what's called the standard deviation. And we can look at the uniformity or the variation within that ROI. And that is one way for us to calculate the noise in an image. So by measuring the standard deviation of a region of interest. But the thing we've learned over time is that it doesn't matter exactly how much noise is in the image, but it also matters what the texture of the noise looks like. So you can see here along this horizontal, on the far right side, you can see the noise tends to be more coarse, a little more blurry, blobbish like. And then the noise over here on the left side tends to be more fine, kind of like sand. And so when we calculate how much noise is in the image, we want to not only measure how much is in there, the magnitude, We also want to know what the texture of that noise is. And to do that, we calculate what's called the noise power spectrum. And you can see here this plot will define along the y-axis the magnitude or the amount of variation of noise in the image. And depending on where the mean of this plot is, if it's skewed to the right over onto this side, it's going to look coarser. If it's skewed to the left, and the mean is over here of this plot, it's going to look finer. Forgive me, I said that backwards. If it's skewed to the left, it's coarser. If it's skewed to the right, it's finer. Forgive me, I said that backwards. So we can use the noise power spectrum to make a much more in-depth calculation of the noise texture in the image. But if we just simply want to know how much we can see or visualize a piece of anatomy inside the body, inside its background, then a very simple way to do this is to calculate what's called the signal to noise ratio, where we take the mean value of the pixels of the ROI and we divide it by the standard deviation of that ROI. That gives us a very simple calculation of the signal in that tissue or in that anatomy. And then the contrast to noise ratio is where we take the difference of two measurements in two different regions of the body. All right, so that is a very quick review of some of the more popular objective calculations we use for image quality. Now, what is probably one of the most popular subjective metric is where we're going to ask some observers, typically radiologists, for them to perform a diagnostic task, and we're going to score them on that task. And what we're going to do is we're going to see how accurate and how consistently they can do that task. And we take all of their results and we calculate something called a receiver operator characteristic curve. If the radiologist does decently well, then their curve will be higher than this dashed red line. That means they do, and if they are no better than simply guessing, it's a 50-50 chance that they got it right or they got it wrong, then their result would lie on this horizontal line. So obviously we want the performer, the radiologist, when given a specific task to test them on, we want them to score up in this corner of the graph. And if anything is here or less, that means their ability to perform that task based on the image and the image quality that we gave them is not good enough. So we can do subjective analyses by simply just testing them. And as I mentioned earlier, the beautiful thing about subjective tests is that these can be performed based on a clinical task. Whereas we just reviewed a variety of objective metrics, MTF, noise power spectrum, SNR, CNR. None of those are things that radiologists do every day. They're never looking at a CT scan and making a dictation on the quality of the MTF. But they would be able to say, I can see a tumor in the liver, or I can see a fracture, a hairline fracture in one of the ribs. And so by asking those questions, but presenting different levels of image quality, we can determine what level of radiation dose and image quality is sufficient for a diagnostic task. Now, when we do these calculations, these subjective calculations, we actually are making a quantitative analysis of a subjective review. So we're taking the opinions and the scores of the radiologists, and we're going to calculate and do some statistics. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the different statistical tests that we can do when we calculate the ROC. Of course, you will have a copy of all my slides, and so you can review this closer if it's of interest to you. But suffice it to say, based on the scores and the ratings that each of the observers or the various different radiologists that are tested, we base their test scores, and we can actually calculate things such as the probability that they can see a detail that is actually present. And we can also calculate the probability that they didn't see an object that was not present. And we can calculate accuracy. And we can calculate a lot of different ways in which a radiologist can perform a specific task. So I have now just presented very basic review of the objective and subjective image quality metrics. So let's put that to a test. I have here the brain scan of one patient. This image is the same brain processed two different ways. So which image has the best image quality? Let's apply our two tasks. First, let's do an objective image quality analysis. So if I simply place an ROI here and I look at the variation of the ROI, I see the image on the right has less image noise than the image on the left. So objectively, the image on the right is better. Now, when I took these images and I had a neuroradiologist look at them, she subjectively said the image on the left was better. The image on the right has less sharp edges and less contrast in the gray-white matter. So now we have a problem. Objectively, I have one result, and subjectively, I have another. And so the beautiful thing about this conundrum is that we can take the two objective and subjective scores and tests, and we can marry them, and we can make them so that they can help us understand both what a radiologist sees or perceives and how we can physically measure the characteristics of the image. So we're going to talk about how we can bring these two together. All right, so when we talk about national dose reference levels, we can also talk about image metrics that we can collect nationally in Thailand, and we can use that data also to establish best practices for image quality. So how could we go about doing that? Well, there's three approaches, of course. We could do surveys or questionnaires. We could do phantom imaging and accreditation. So we're going to talk about all three and give examples on how they can be applied in Thailand. So the first one is surveys and questionnaires. I give an example of a publication that came out where a group of scientists and radiologists looked at the way they do CT scans in Taiwan. And what they did was they looked across the entire island. There were about 242 CT scanners in all of the various hospitals in Taiwan. And so they sent out a questionnaire and they asked each of the hospitals to fill out the following. Tell us what your scanner make and model is. Tell us how many slices the CT scanner has, etc. They wanted to know what were your technique factors, how much MA, KV, what's your rotation time, slice thickness. They wanted to know a variety of different factors. And they said to pick 10 normal random brain scans. And I want you to go in and tell us how much dose or how much volume CTDI and dose length product it took to acquire that image. And then they used the DLP, the dose length product, to calculate effective dose. And then they asked them in each of those 10 images to place an ROI in the image. It had to be exactly 100 millimeters squared. And it was in a very specific location, the right periventricular. And they gave them, and then they calculated how much noise was in the image, and then ultimately how much the SNR, the signal to noise ratio, was. So they took all of these questionnaires from the 242 CT scans and the 10 images per 242, so obviously 2,420 data points. They did remove some of the data points because some of the questionnaires didn't come complete. And of course, some of the data wasn't comparable. And they divided it up based on geographic locations on the island, and they looked at various different types of scanners. So if it's a single slice, it's less than 64 slice, or a 64 slice or greater CT scan. And by comparing the SNR, they could look at how the signal to noise ratio varied as a function of machine type, acquisition parameters, and dose. And so this was one example of how they could take and do a dose. They could make an image quality survey and relate that to the dose surveys that they've been doing on the island. So they're, even though generally we're most interested in understanding the radiation dose to the Thai population, we can also find a way to link the image quality that is produced at those dose levels. So one advantage of using a questionnaire to acquire this image quality data is it's low tech. We can collect this data, we can send it to any and all hospitals. They do not need to have fancy servers and fancy computers. They can simply fill out the form and return it. The disadvantage to this is human error. If someone writes the wrong number down or doesn't read and follow the instructions, they may do it wrong, in which case that data has to be thrown away. Now, it's also difficult to perform a lot of different problems or tasks. In this case, they did one thing. They looked at one ROI in the right periventricular, and they filled out a bunch of other data. If they had asked them to do 5 or 10 tasks, it's just a lot of work. And so using a survey, it becomes difficult to ask many questions. And of course, it's labor intensive. Someone at the hospital has to fill all this work out, and then someone at the main center that does all the data analysis has to collect all that data and do the analysis. So it's very labor intensive. So what is another option? The other option, if we were to look at image quality across all of Thailand, would be to use a standard, such as a imaging phantom. So let's talk a little about how we could do this. So I'm going to give you an example of how we have done that in the USA. Basically, what we would do is you would pick a type of phantom, and then you have to send out very specific imaging instructions. So that phantom will be scanned the exact same way at every hospital that participates. And then once you do that, all of that data can be uploaded, the scans of those phantoms, and then all of that data will be processed in one location. So it's a little simpler in the sense that the hospital, all they have to do is scan the phantom. And if they do it right, all the data, and then upload the data, they're finished with that. So in a publication in 2019, Dr. Samay, I was part of this group, we looked at how could we do this for CT. So I'm going to give you an example of one way we came up with to do this for CT. So there is a phantom that we use here in the United States. And I'm sure you guys also have access to something like this too. It's called the ACR CT accreditation phantom. The type of phantom isn't necessarily important because there's a lot of different options out there. But this phantom gave us the opportunity to do a variety of calculations because there are 4 sections in this phantom. So you can see how we talked about being able to measure the MTF. In this phantom, we can calculate the modulation transfer function. There is also a region in the phantom that's uniform. So we can look at how the noise magnitude is impacted and the noise texture. And from that, we can calculate the noise power spectrum. And we can take this and we can actually take this phantom and we can use the results from that phantom and we can predict how a radiologist would respond to a diagnostic task. So the question is here, it's fine to do all this imaging in a phantom, but radiologists don't look at phantoms. They look at scans of the body. So can this phantom predict how well a radiologist will read an image if it's a scan of the patient? And so we can do that. And let me show you how we can do that. So what we need to do is define a task. So let's ask a question. Can we define how well a radiologist will be able to find or detect a low contrast nodule in a soft tissue organ, such as a liver? So we've made a few calculations using this phantom. We've calculated the MTF and the noise power spectrum. We've now defined the task. So in this case, for example, how well can they find various different size lesions at different contrast levels in an organ? And we combine the basic calculations, we combine this task that we're trying to answer, and there is a mathematical approach that allows us to combine all of that and predict how well a radiologist will be able to find a lesion in a CT image, for example. So what this allows us to do now is, using this phantom that we can image at all the different hospitals in Thailand, is we can now look at image quality as a function of dose, the type of tube potential or KV we use, MA, or tube current modulation, the size of the patient, or in our case, phantom. We can ask different questions. It doesn't have to just be a small lesion in a liver. We could look at spiculated lesions, or perfectly well defined margins. We can look at high contrast, low contrast tasks. We can do this for a variety of different acquisition techniques, such as image thick, a 3 millimeter image thickness or a 5 millimeter image thickness. And by doing this, we can predict how well a radiologist will perform in the body, not just the phantom. And so let me give you an example. This is a publication that we just, here in Cincinnati Children's Hospital, we just published at the end of last year. And we asked this question. We have all of these new deep learning reconstruction algorithms, these DLRs. We wanted to know if this deep learning reconstruction algorithm would allow a radiologist to see a lesion better than if we used the standard iterative reconstruction CT, iterative reconstruction, or the old traditional filter back projection. So we looked at 4 different reconstruction algorithms, and we applied a very specific task. So we first had to calculate the MTF or the TTF and the noise power spectrum for our CT scanners by just imaging one phantom. And then, as I said, we defined the task of low contrast, of defining a low contrast liver met. And what we found, as you can see by this plot, is yes, the deep learning algorithm was superior in determining, for a radiologist, their detection accuracy improved when they were looking for small objects. Now, as the object got bigger, upwards of 7 millimeters, it didn't matter what type of reconstruction algorithm was used, the radiologist was equally as accurate to detect or find a liver met. And so this is a way of using a phantom to define how well a radiologist will perform in the clinic. Now you may ask, okay, that's fine. That's a mathematical equation. How accurate is the mathematical equation? In a different publication, a group of scientists looked at, and they compared human accuracy here on the x-axis with the mathematical accuracy, or the image quality accuracy measured in a phantom. Now, for every time the mathematical algorithm was as accurate as a radiologist, that data would lie along this horizontal line, this line of what's called unity that goes along the diagonal from one corner to the next corner of the graph. So what we see here is fitting the data showed that there was a goodness of fit of 84%. Or in other ways to say this, when the human was 80% accurate, when the radiologist was 80% accurate at finding or determining the task, the algorithm was usually somewhere between 69% and a little over 80%, about 83% accurate. So sometimes the mathematical algorithm over-predicted and sometimes it under-predicted. And it was roughly in that 10 to 15% range. So if you can assume and accept 10 to 15% accuracy or inaccuracy, then what you see here is a way to use a phantom to predict if image quality will be sufficient for a radiologist to perform their tasks. So the advantages of using a phantom are that we can control how we image that phantom. We can image a phantom 100,000 different ways. We don't have to worry about overexposing a phantom. And we can then test that phantom for a variety of different scan parameters and reconstruction algorithms. And it allows us to ask a lot of questions. Whereas in the questionnaire, we could usually only ask one or two questions. And it's also easier on the hospital because all they have to do is image the phantom. That phantom data then will go up to a server and it'll be analyzed somewhere else. The disadvantage is that we are limited to the number of test samples in the sense that you can ask the question 1,000 different ways, but you can only image it so many times. If you send millions and millions of images, then the system just can't process that. So there is an upper limit to which even using a phantom has a disadvantage. And then the other issue is, like I said, being able to calculate MTF and noise power spectrum is not actually perfectly clinical. And so there is that 84%, there is that 10 to 15% inaccuracy that these algorithms will produce. One of probably the best advantages to all of this is all of the algorithms that we use to calculate these things, to make these predictions, they're free and they're readily available, something that you can access. I give you here a web address. So that publication that I was a part of, that we looked at when we did all these calculations, all the software that we wrote is now available for anyone to go and download. And some of it's actually open source, in which case you could download it and use it for your own purposes in Thailand to answer very specific questions that you may have that are different than the questions that we may have asked in the US. And then finally, accreditation. Jiraporn mentioned this, and she talked a little about how accreditation is not required yet, but it is something that can help steer a hospital to be a part of the dose collection and the image quality analysis, so that we can help standardize and improve image quality and dose and the level of dose that we use all through Thailand. So in the US, we have a variety of different accrediting bodies, and each one of these accrediting bodies actually defines using a phantom. So the phantom is imaged at the hospital. There are very specific ways we image that phantom. Those images are then sent to the accrediting body, and then they will rate or score those images. If the images are deemed sufficient, then the hospital becomes accredited, which is to say that it meets the minimum level required for a diagnostic task. So the image quality and the level of radiation dose is good. That said, it doesn't say that it's better than one hospital or better than another. It just simply says that this hospital is doing sufficient for what we call good image quality and good radiation dose. Now, in the US, there's incentive for us to do this because hospitals that are not accredited cannot be reimbursed for their studies. Now, I know the way Thailand is set up differently with their national healthcare system, it has different incentives, but the use of accreditation can help standardize imaging quality throughout Thailand. So the advantages, of course, to a nationally recognized accreditation is that it standardizes all the participants. It keeps everyone basically on the same playing field. And the testing is reproducible. And so we can ask the hospital to be reaccredited every couple of years. In fact, in the US, every 3 years, we have to reaccredit our hospital. And that helps make sure that we are consistent year after year. Now, disadvantage to this process is it is labor intensive. It requires people to make these measurements. And it requires you to have a national accrediting body, which you have in Thailand, for them to analyze the images and to analyze the radiation dose and to make that judgment. So, in conclusion, collecting and analyzing doses is very important. But what's also important is that when we ask the question of how much dose, that's only half the answer. The other half is the image quality sufficient for our radiologists to perform the tasks they need to? So we really need to be looking at both image quality and radiation dose. Excuse me. So there are multiple ways for us to make collect this image quality data. We went over simple questionnaires. We went over the use of phantoms or an imaging standard. And we talked about the idea of using an accrediting body to make that judgment. So in the beginning, I asked a question: what is image quality? If you noticed, I didn't actually answer that question. So as we go through and we talk about each of the modalities in the coming weeks, I'm going to answer that question. When we talk about CT, when we talk about DR and CR, we can get very specific about what makes a good plain film image. And how can we measure that? How can we set the framework so that all of the different hospitals around Thailand can meet that framework? And then we'll talk about, obviously, the radiation dose associated with that. All right. I thank you for your attention for this first talk. And I turn the time back over to you, Tanya, for the question and answer period.
So thank you so much, Sam, for giving us the overview about image quality and dose, how to correct the dose. But it should start with the image quality, that is a diagnostic quality for us as a radiologist to answer the questions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. This is the questions from me. I am a little bit confused. Can you explain it to me again? Because you're talking about the software, the Phantom survey, which is likely the way to go for the image quality, right? Because we try to reduce a subjective opinion.
So,
that things, and you have the Phantom software that do some calculations. And that calculation said a radiologist gonna like or don't like it, right? Is that the same thing?
It is. So the software that I talked about, let me put my screen back up. So the software right here, this software right here, it allows someone like a technologist or a medical physicist to image the phantom, and the software will then calculate what we call the detection indice. And it will predict, kind of like I showed here on this slide, how well a radiologist would be able to see or do a specific task. In our case, we were really interested in being able to discover a tumor in the liver. And obviously, we imaged and we looked at that across a variety of different doses. So if you have a really low dose, noisy image, would the radiologist be able to visualize that task or that tumor as well as if they did it in a really high dose, noiseless image? And these algorithms, this equation that I showed right here, it's able to make a prediction. Now that prediction, as I indicated, it's pretty accurate. It's about 85% accurate, generally speaking. And so I can predict generally how well, Tanya, you could look at, so you could look at maybe an image and define a specific task. Now, the best thing about these mathematical algorithms are we can ask a lot of different questions. And so subjectively, in the past, we would have to get you and a couple of your colleagues to sit down and look at 100 or 200 images. And then you would say, okay, there is a tumor here, there is not a tumor here. There is a tumor here, or you could say how big the tumor is, and you would all have to measure them. But using this mathematical algorithm, we can get pretty close to accurately predicting how well you would do. And so this is one of those ways we can take a phantom. We can either all the hospitals in Thailand can have the same phantom, or you can take that phantom and your medical physicist or technologist could go around and image at a variety of different regions. And then with this software that you can download for free, someone at the OAP, at the Office of Atomic Peace, they could go in and they could process this data, and then they could look at how the image quality, how those images measured at all the different hospitals would allow the radiologists in those different areas to make their diagnostic task. And so it's just a way to associate the radiation dose being used at that hospital with the task, the clinical task needed.
I see. Okay, sounds good to me. Ajahn Pan, do you have any comments, questions, or?
You said the survey phantom is the ACRCT accreditation phantom?
Yes. That was simply one of the phantoms we used. There are a lot of different ones you can buy. I think actually when I was in Thailand, you guys have what's called the CAT fan, which is basically the same phantom, but with just different sections. You can do the same calculations with it.
Okay, so the Thailand can use CAT fan phantom?
Yes. In fact, my study that I did, this one right here, I actually used a CAT fan.
So how often do we need to do like the phantom survey? So it depends on like a cycle for accreditations, or like maybe if you want to be better, maybe we should do it like every month, every year, or what is like the frequency that we're supposed to do?
For a national survey, I would do it as a function of accreditation. So maybe every couple of years, for example, in the US, we do it every 3 years. Mm-hmm. So in Thailand, maybe you guys could do it every 2 or 3 years. It depends. I would do it at the exact same cycle that you set up your DRLs. So in my next talk, we're going to talk about measuring and collecting the dose data and submitting it to establish DRLs. And the IAEA typically says you should do it at least every 5 years. So you could probably do the image quality at the same time, the image quality assessment at the same time as you do the dose. And it probably would take that long because you have various different regions in Thailand. So it might take a while to get the northern hospital data analyzed, along with the southern, and then, of course, central and Bangkok. It really depends on how many staff members you intend to have at the OAP, because they're the ones that actually have to process the data and actually analyze it. So if you're doing it too often every year, you either need a lot of workers or you need or it's just you won't be able to make and analyze it all. Now, the nice thing is you can do all of this analysis locally. So if you have lead technologists or medical physicists at your various different hospitals, you could do this. They could do it every year. And then they would be able to say, hey, our doses can come down here. You know, if we're looking at low contrast METs, we could actually change our protocols this way. And so this is actually how I approach doing protocol and optimization in my hospital every year. And so, but on a national level, I wouldn't do it more than 3 to 5 years.
Thanks, Sam. This is Chirapon. I just like to ask you, when we going for the survey or try to do the research for the whole country, if we use different kinds of phantoms, can we combine the data, or we need to separate them?
So you can, it depends on the task. For example, if you have the CAT fan phantom and the ACR phantom, 2 different phantoms, but you can actually still calculate the same MTF. You can still do these 2 exact same calculations. So in that case, yes, you can combine them, but they have to have basic structures inside them. You know, when you look at this phantom right here, it has very basic structures in it. You know, it has these sensitometry plugs in it, which a CAT fan also has. So if you have a phantom that doesn't do this, then you would have to have 2 separate responses. And then that would probably not be as good.
Mm-hmm. As you said.
Yeah.
As you said, yeah.
I was going to say, if a standard phantom, if Thailand wanted to establish a standardized phantom, that's the best, because then they can do that. Either they can have that at all the hospitals or all the regions, and then that can be shared. And then from there on, every cycle, you use the same phantom. In the US, we've been using this ACR phantom for 20 years. It's kind of getting old.
Okay.
So which means yes, you have only one phantom, like from the ACR. So that's why you have the same data, same information, and you can use that data for the national comparison, and you can also use that data for the internal comparison to like a quality adjustment or control for the internal in the hospital. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I think what we should plan for the next steps in our project to related to radiation dose measurement and image quality, that for the hospitals that have their own phantoms, they can use these phantoms and I think perform the annual test and show the data and compare among the hospitals, and to lead to lead the other people or the other hospital to come in and then share the data. I think this one is going to be another good project too. And for the next project of the DRLs, we should set up the standard for how many years that we should set up the DRL, maybe 3 years or 5 years, that we should have the exact schedule and working together in the committee and set up the standard, even though it's not the law or something, but it should be the regulation that we should do together. I think this one is very good. Thanks, Sam, for the idea.
May I ask the audience in Thai มีใครที่เป็นนักฟิสิกส์ที่เข้าฟังบ้างคะอยากทราบว่าหรือว่าเทคที่ใช้แคทแฟนแฟนทอมคืออยากรู้ว่าประเทศไทยมีอยู่กี่ตัวนะคะพอจะมีใครมีข้อมูลไหมคะ
ที่อยู่ในซูมมี
อาจารย์หนูพอมีข้อมูลไหมใช่ไม่รู้เนี่ยอาจารย์สวนีเปล่าอาจารย์ถามอะไรนะคะถามว่าเมืองไทยเนี่ยแคทแฟนแฟนทอมมีทุกที่ไหมคะมีกี่ที่ไม่มีทุกที่ค่ะ
แต่ส
มี
ถาบั
ป
น
ระ
การ
มาณ
แพท
กี่
ย์มี
ตัว
ค่ะ
ส่วน
ที่
ให
ไหน
ญ่
มี
แค่
ใครมีบ้างนะหนู
โรงเรียนแพทย์
ตอนเนี้ย ACR ก็จะมีที่พญาไท2กับรามา จุฬาหนูไม่แน่ใจ แต่ว่าถ้าเป็นตัวแคทแฟนเนี่ยจะมีเยอะอยู่ค่ะ เพราะว่า
ใช่ค่ะ
ทางเทอราปีถ้าที่ไหนมีเทอราปีเนี่ยส่วนใหญ่เทอราปีจะมีแคทแฟนด้วย แต่หนูไม่แน่ใจว่าในแอกเนี่ยโรงเรียนแพทย์เนี่ยมีแน่ๆค่ะอาจารย์แต่ว่าเอกชนหนูก็อย่างปิยะไม่ใช่ปิยเวชบำรุงราษฎร์อะไรอย่างเงี้ยกรุงเทพมี
ค่ะ แต่
โรงพยาบาล
สาธารณสุขนี่มีไหมคะ ถ้าเป็นทางโรงพยาบาลศูนย์
หนูไม่แน่หนูคิดว่าไม่นั่นมัน
ไม่
จะ
น่า
ตรวจ
มี
ด้วยโควิดนะคะอาจารย์หนูว่าถ้านั่นก็คือโควิดเนี่ยเขาเอา
ค่ะ
ตัว
กรม
แคท
วิท
แฟ
ย์
น
มี
ไปตรวจ
กรมวิทย์
quality
มี
ทุกปี
ใช่ไห
ข
ม
องทุกที่อยู่แล้ว
ค่ะ
ถ้าก
ร
อาม จารย์จะ
วิท
เปรียบ
ย์มี
เทียบเนี่ยอาจารย์สามารถใช้ data ของกรมวิทย์นะคะ
ค่ะเขาคือใช้แปลว่าเขาวัดแล้วเราสามารถเอาตรงนั้นมาใช้ได้เลย แต่ว่าตรงนั้นมี clinical task ไหมที่เขาวัดไว้อะค่ะ มีกรมวิ
เขา
ทย์
จะมี
ฟัง
เขาจะ
ไหม
มีค่ะเขามีค่าที่เป็น image quality แต่ว่าโปรโตคอลที่เขาใช้เนี่ยอาจต้องเช็คโปรโตคอลนิดนึงนะคะอาจารย์
อาจารย์ปานคะคือ
ค่ะ
เสนอว่าเดี๋ยวเรากลับไปเราไปทำโครงการเซอร์เวย์ว่าพวกเราในประเทศเรามีแฟนตอมทั้งหมดกี่ตัวและมีอยู่กี่ที่
มีกี่ช
แล้
นิ
ว
ด
คง
ด้วย
มีกี่ชนิดนะฮะมีกี่ชนิด
ชนิดเหรอคะ
เพราะว่าที่จุฬาภรณ์นี่น่าจะเป็นเอเชียแฟนตอม
ค่ะ
นะ
คือ
แล้วก็
ที่
คือที่เสนอให้เดี๋ยวเราต้องไปทำเซอร์เวย์คือมาถามกันตรงนี้คงจะไม่ทราบหรอกค่ะ เราไปเซอร์เวย์กันก่อนแล้วเดี๋ยวค่อยวางแผน
ค่ะ คือเข้าใจว่าโรงพยาบาลมีไม่เยอะ ตอนแรกที่ฟังแล้วคิดว่าโรงพยาบาลที่น่าจะได้ประโยชน์คือโรงพยาบาลที่เก็บโดสที่สูงเกินไปกับต่ำเกินไป ถ้าเราไปspecific ไปที่โรงพยาบาลที่ใช้ high dose แล้วเราไปดูว่า image quality เขาดีเกินไปไหม อย่างเงี้ยค่ะ หรือโรงพยาบาลที่ very low dose เนี่ยแล้วก็บอกว่า image quality ใช้ได้ไหม อันนั้นอาจจะช่วยเขาแก้ปัญหาบางอย่างได้ เพราะตอนนี้มันมีปัญหาเหมือนกันว่าเวลาที่เขาลดโดสแล้วเขาไม่มั่นใจในภาพ อย่างเงี้ยค่ะ
ค่ะคือกว่าเราจะทราบว่าโรงพยาบาลไหนใช้ high dose โรงพยาบาลไหนใช้ low dose นะฮะมันก็ต้องมีโรงพยาบาลจำนวนโรงพยาบาลพอสมควรที่เข้ามาจอยเราเพราะทุกวันนี้เรามีอยู่ไม่กี่โรงพยาบาลแล้วก็เหมือนกับคล้ายๆกับบน on the voluntary basis ใช่ไหมคะเราจะเริ่มต้นจากกลุ่มที่เรามีแต่ว่าเรื่องการอันนี้กำลังมองไปไกลกว่าเรื่องกับไอ้รูทีกับงานที่เรากำลังทำอยู่ปัจจุบันเนี่ยคือตอนนี้มองไปที่2 level นะฮะ level 1คือเป็น national level คือว่าถ้าเราอยากจะทำไอ้พวก quality แล้วก็ทำเรื่อง DILs แล้วก็ quality ของทั้งประเทศเนี่ยเราต้องมีตัวเลขว่าแฟนตอมเรามีอยู่เท่าไหร่มีอยู่ที่ไหนบ้างแล้วก็ capacity ที่เราจะทำนี่เราจะทำยังไงกรมวิทย์ก็ยังคงต้องเป็นแม่งายกับเราแล้วก็เราก็ต้องมานั่งคุยโปรโตคอลกันแล้วก็เซตสแตนดาร์ดร่วมกันเพราะตอนนี้การทำเรื่องไอ้ diagnostic imaging quality นี่ทั้งหมดนี่นะมันจะอยู่ภายใต้กระทรวงสาธารณสุขเพราะกรมวิทย์ต้องเข้ามาเป็นแม่งานแล้วเราก็ต้องช่วยกันคุยกันว่าจะทำยังไงอันนี้เป็น national level นะฮะแต่ว่าถ้าเป็น individual institute หรือ hospital ที่เราอยากจะเข้าไปช่วย adjust คุณภาพทั้งคุณภาพของภาพแล้วก็เรื่อง dose safety ก็คงต้อง on voluntary basis ว่าโรงพยาบาลไหนสนใจแล้วเราอาจจะ set up ทีมที่ช่วยเขาจะมีหรือไม่มีก็ไม่เป็นไรถ้าเขาสนใจเข้าร่วมแล้วเราก็อาจจะลองเลือกสักกลุ่มหนึ่งที่แบบพอจะทำงานได้ในปีแรกและปีถัดไปเราก็อาจจะ apply แค่เป็น research project แล้วก็ไปขอเงินวิจัยแล้วก็มาทำให้มันเป็นเรื่องเป็นราวแล้วก็มีคนที่ต้อง dedicated มาทำงานนี้ที่เป็นทีมในเชิงการทำอย่างนี้นะอันนี้เป็นความคิดที่เสนอนะคะกับทีม
ดูเป็นงานยังใหญ่อยู่ ยังงานอีกไกลแล้วก็ต้องใช้พลังก็ร่วมด้วยช่วยกันนะคะ Hey Sam, I have a couple questions from the Facebook Live. So first question is about the software. So they ask which software is represented the DRL and from which manufacturers?
Those softwares that I talked about don't specifically talk about DRLs. So far, we're just talking about image quality. So we'll talk about DRLs next, but I have not presented that yet.
Okay, yes. Next question is about from like a radiologist, Dr. Son Supha. So she asks, from her understanding after listen to your lectures, may I conclude from my understanding that there are many ways to calculate image quality. How do I know which one should be used?
That is difficult. Probably the best way to go forward is to use those mathematical observers, because you can calculate SNR, for example, or you can calculate MTF. That's just one measurement. But using these new model observers, it combines multiple different aspects of the image. The image sharpness, the noise magnitude, the texture. It combines all of that into one model, and we use that then to predict how well a radiologist can perform. So that's become probably the new standard when we go to, for example, when we publish our results, so that we can define image quality. And it's just more based on human observers. A lot of publications will still do a objective measurement. So they'll calculate MTF, NPS, all that, and they will still do observer studies where they'll get 2 or 3 or 4 radiologists to look at images. But more and more, the subjective nature has become less popular, and more the objective mathematical model is sufficient.
So I mean, for our daily practice as a radiologist, what can we do in terms of image quality or anything, or we just need the phantom and we need a medical physicist?
Of course, the latter. I can come to Thailand and I can work. I'd love to come and. But the ultimate answer is, what is it that you need to answer your question? And that's the hard part. There are very simple questions. Sometimes when you're looking at an image, you might just be trying to rule out appendicitis. And so do you need a really high quality image for that? Probably not. If you're looking for a low contrast infection, so the patient's on chemotherapy and you need to see if there's an infection, you need higher dose. And so to simply say, oh, this image is less noisy and this image is more noisy, doesn't quite answer that question. And so you do this every day as a radiologist. You can immediately look at this image and you can say, I am confident in my diagnosis. And that is ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to get away from image quality, and we're trying to say that this image will provide you the highest confidence to do your task. Mm-hmm. And like I showed those 3 pictures of the cadaver at first, that very good, clean looking image probably will give you confidence every day. But we don't need that much radiation. There's a very good chance the middle one, or even the really, really bad looking image, would still give you enough confidence if it's a simple, it's a kidney stone and you need to see if there's a kidney stone in the kidney. So I hate to say it, it's a very difficult task to answer, question to answer. What is appropriate image quality? And so I think the best way we can approach that is to set up a kind of a national standard. And that helps allow all of the different hospitals to know, at a minimum, the protocols they're using is good enough. Now, if some of them are better, that's a good thing. But some of them, we just don't want them to be too poor or too bad, so that you as a radiologist don't have enough confidence, which requires repeat imaging, which is more dose, or a misdiagnosis, which is even worse.
May I ask one more question? I would like to know that as Thailand doesn't have many physicists, medical physicists in diagnostic radiology, and so if we would like to measure the quality with the software and the phantom, does it need training? It's very easy to use.
The answer is no. The answer is yes, it's easy to use, but yes, it does require training. So when I was there last in May of 2019, I actually had a chance to meet with Anjali, and she had a graduate student, Hatay Pat, I think was her name. And she
yes,
was actually,
Pat, yeah.
Yeah, Pat, thank you. Forgive me, I pronounced your name wrong. I hope you're not listening. and so they are working on building up this very thing in Thailand. So what I presented to today isn't something you can only do in the US. This is something that actually is possible in Thailand. You have the experts and the people there that are able to do this. And so you can establish a way to do this. And then once you have the software, really anyone can run that software. But you really do want to have someone that understands the physics, the mathematics of it, so that they can figure out, oh, okay, well, we need to adjust things this way. So if the Thai results are, a certain level, they might say, okay, well, what we need to do is we need to maybe decrease dose here or increase dose here. And so they can understand what the results mean. So yes, anyone could probably run the software, but no, it probably takes a specific knowledge to understand and interpret the results.
One more question from Facebook Live. So you remember the first question that we talked about the software represented the DRL. So actually she wants to know about what deep learning reconstruction software that represented the DRL.
Oh, I understand. Sure. And we'll definitely talk about this more when we go into each of the modalities. But we have for the longest time been using, iterative reconstruction or different ways to reconstruct the image. So I gave the example of CT, and it does a pretty good job of cleaning up the noise to make the image look less noisy. But deep learning is a new type of reconstruction that is available. And so depending on the type of CT scanner you have in your hospital, you can request to have that reconstruction added. And it, in my personal opinion, it's phenomenal. It really does take a lot of the noise out of the image, and it makes the image look like it's high dose, but it really is really low dose. It's just technology in imaging changes about every 3 to 5 years. And so that's hard because you don't want to have to buy a new CT scanner every 3 to 5 years because that's expensive. But what that means is, given enough time, this new technology will start at the top and it will slowly trickle down. And so when I was visiting, for example, in Thailand, I had a chance to go through and see a couple of different hospitals, and you guys have amazing technology. You have the best of the best CT scanner. And so you should reach out to your vendors, if it's Canon or GE, and you should ask them, I would like to see the new deep learning reconstruction algorithms. CT has it, fluoroscopy and DR will have it soon. Nuclear medicine, PET, real soon also, but CT is the first to have this new technology.